Aristopia by Castello, Newton, Holford. Introduction. Books giving us a history of the future, a future bright with the millennial dawn of the optimist, or dark with the goblin-haunted night of the pessimist, books in French, with a future French and fantastic, and books in English, with a future Anglo-Saxon and matter-of-fact, are much in vogue. But of books giving a history of the past as it might have been if the current of events had been turned at a critical point by some man with sufficient virtue and mental power, combined with the power which some fortunate material circumstance might have given him, I know not one. Alas for the world that the makers of history who have had the greatest powers combined with the greatest opportunities have been men whose selfish aims have made their utmost efforts recoil in ruin on their own heads. Washington indeed had great virtues, a great opportunity, and good talents, but neither was his opportunity the greatest that history has furnished, nor his mental power so vast, nor his vision of the future so far-reaching and clairvoyant as that of many who have lived before him and since, nor was his devotion to the welfare of mankind so ardent and all-absorbing. The fathers of the Constitution have been much praised for their wisdom and foresight, and with justice. But there have been men with no opportunities like theirs who were able to look much farther into the future, and who were much more in advance of their age. There were evils which the leaders of the Revolution ought to have foreseen, and probably did not, and others they may have foreseen, but had no power to avert. Their power was limited, and the materials with which they had to work were refractory. Old evils were so deeply embedded in the customs, prejudices, and thoughts of men when our government was forming, that the influence of a Washington, a Jefferson, and an Adams would have striven in vain to eradicate them. Then, too, there were evils of which they could have had no conception. They could not have foreseen the application of steam power to transportation and manufacturing, making a few men of great wealth as much the lords of the great highways as were the robber barons of the Middle Ages, with their castles in every mountain pass and on every river ford, taking ruinous toll of every traveller, and the owners of vast plants of machinery as absolutely lords of the workmen who attend the machines, and the greater number who are displaced by the machines, as ever the feudal baron was lord of the serfs and villeins on his estates. Even if they had foreseen these evils, it is hard to see how they could have prevented them. They came too late. Their power was too small. And from these evils it has come that this great republic of the New World, so long the hope of the poor and oppressed of the Old World, is fast becoming like Europe socially, and threatens to become even worse than Europe. Now, when the bounties of nature, which a little while ago seemed exhaustless, have been all appropriated, this favoured land presents the most violent contrasts of wealth with its pitiless power, and poverty with its abject weakness. The disinherited begin to feel their doom. Their blind and hopeless, but strong and desperate, struggles against that doom have already begun in wasting strikes and bloody riots, and at every new outburst the wave of fire and blood spreads wider and rises higher. We reproach the nations of Europe with their millions of armed men, but those millions are levied to repel the invasion of foreign foes. In our land it is hardly a secret that the millions of militia are mustering and drilling for the principal purpose of suppressing insurrection against the plutocracy by the lower classes, the labouring class of our own citizens. In every American city are rising the castles of the plutocracy in the shape of great armories for the militia. But why, some may ask, should we turn from a future thus dark and threatening, to look vainly on a past which might have been, but which, alas, never was? Well, I could never quite agree with the philosophy of Whittier's oft-quoted couplet, "Of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, 'It might have been.'" Or Dante's despairing cry of a lost soul, "Nessun maggior dolore che ricordarsi del tempo felice nella miseria." There is no greater grief than memory of happy days in misery. Or, as the hero of Tennyson's Locksley Hall paraphrases it, "A sorrow's crown of sorrow is remembering happier things." Not so. It is a relief and a solace, a pleasure, although a mournful one in the misery that is, to contemplate the happiness that was or might have been. Then, too, the looking back upon the parting of the ways which led us from happiness to misery may teach us to look forward to the parting of the ways which may lead from misery to happiness. Studying the opportunities which we have lost may teach us to grasp the opportunities which are to come. Let us, then, take what pleasure we may in figuring a man of great wisdom, foresight, and genius, with an unselfish devotion to the welfare of humanity, placed with immense power at the parting of the ways in the course of human events, seizing the opportunity to turn the march of bewildered and struggling humanity into the path leading up and away from the dangerous marshes over which dance the deluding ignes fatui of ancient errors, and under which lie the black quagmires of antique evils. Thus to contemplate the past which might have been may in some small measure teach us to discern in the future the opportunity, to seize which, if there be no one man with sufficient wisdom, power, and virtue, there may be found a combination of men whose aggregate wisdom, power, and virtue may be sufficient to turn the march of events out of the night of civilization's destruction which some prophets see close ahead, into the brighter day foreseen by the seers of the millennium. I cannot afford, as some greater story-tellers have calmly and confidently done, to ignore the possibilities, not to mention the probabilities. But, some may say, your story of the mass of gold is an utter impossibility. Not so. That such a mass of gold has never been found is true. That it does not exist and cannot be discovered by no means follows. If the theory is true that the surface of the earth was once molten and liquid, the gold, by its immense weight, must have sunk below the lighter elements so far that when the crust of the earth became solid, it could have come to the surface only by means of an eruption from a great depth. That the amount of gold in the whole globe is so small, in comparison with the rest of the materials, as seems from the amount found upon the surface, is not at all probable. In the depths of the earth are probably hundreds of thousands of cubic miles of gold. An eruption from so great a depth as to throw up a few hundred cubic feet of gold in a single mass would be by no means a marvel. And a few hundred cubic feet of gold, although of almost incalculable value, would be of trifling bulk compared with the mass of lighter materials thrown out at every volcanic eruption. The region in which this narrative locates the mine contains numerous quartz dykes in which some gold has been found. The world has had many men with even greater virtues, clearer foresight, and more entire devotion to the good of humanity than have been ascribed to Ralph Morton. That the opportunity of a new continent on which a new civilization could be wrought out existed 300 years ago is a matter of history. Given, then, the man, the means, and the opportunity, the natural result would be as follows. End of the introduction. Chapter 1 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. On a blustering December day in 1607, a ship was working its way up the James River in Virginia. It was the English ship Seagull, Captain Christopher Newport bringing what was called the first supply to the infant colony at Jamestown, planted 7 months before. 70 new colonists swarmed the decks of the vessel, their gaze eagerly bent forward to discover their goal, the little cluster of cabins over which floated the Red Cross flag of England, now visible far away up the river. A strong northerly wind was blowing, hurrying the broken cloud rack across the sky. It was the remains of a gale which had swept the coast the day before, when the Seagull and her consort, the Phoenix, were striving to get between the capes of the Chesapeake. The Seagull succeeded, but the Phoenix was ill built to work to windward, the wind being somewhat westerly, and she was driven back and had to bear off to sea to escape the dangerous coast which stretches far southward from Cape Henry. But now the wind had veered to a few points east of north, and the Seagull was making fair headway. Soon her passengers could see every detail of the little village, the 25 or 30 log cabins thatched with reeds, the stockade enclosing the village, the dark, leafless forest behind, the bare spots on the river bank white with snow, for it was an unprecedentedly severe winter, and the throng of people on the bank eagerly awaiting the arrival of the ship with every demonstration of joy. Arrived in front of the village, the sails were reefed and the anchor was dropped. The ship swung in almost against the bank, so much deeper was the water then than now, when the mud from the ploughed fields has been washing in for nearly 3 centuries. So near she lay that with her boats and some planks a bridge was formed from the ship to the shore, and lines were run out from stem and stern and fastened to trees on the bank as moorings for the vessel. Captain Newport went ashore, and was immediately shaking hands with his friends and members of the council. Before he set foot on the shore, he became aware that some evil cloud was overshadowing the little colony which he had left in fair circumstances 6 months before. Although the men were shouting and tossing their hats with joy, it was rather the joy of prison-worn captives at the opening of their dungeon doors than anything else he could think of. Then, too, there were not half so many as he expected. He hoped the rest were away at work in the woods, but he feared not. As soon as possible he sought out one of the council, a stalwart man with a rough, heavy beard and a face browned and seamed by a life of exposure and warfare in all 4 quarters of the globe, in short, Captain John Smith, to learn what had passed in the colony since his departure. Newport and Smith were both members of the council, and as such had never agreed, but although Newport was vain and incompetent and jealous of Smith, he knew the latter was honest and competent, and would tell him truly how things had gone in his absence. And the story came straight and blunt from the mouth of the old soldier. When the ships had departed for England, the colonists had been reduced to live on boiled wheat and barley, mouldy and wormy from frying 26 weeks in the ship's hold, as Smith said. For the voyage out, of a piece with the folly of the whole enterprise, had been made by way of the Canaries and the West Indies, and they had loitered months in the tropical waters of those islands. No well had been dug, and the water of the river was warm, brackish, and impure with vegetable matter. The site of the settlement was a low bank, the highest part no more than 12 feet above the river, and surrounded with marshes, so that in warm weather the night air was always laden with deadly malaria. One of the council, Bartholomew Gosnold, the first English sea captain who had sense enough to sail straight across the Atlantic from England to Virginia, had strongly opposed the chosen site, well knowing the danger of malaria, of which he was among the first to perish. He had favoured a location on a high bank 20 miles below Jamestown. Smith, being under arrest at the time, could not aid Gosnold in his protest. Their president, the vain, foolish, cowardly, jealous, greedy, selfish, and otherwise contemptible Wingfield, had weighed like an incubus on the colony for months, as Smith then said and afterward wrote, engrossing to his private oatmeal, sack, oil, aqua vitae, beef, eggs, or what not, leaving the others to starve. At last the endurance of the colonists was worn out, and they deposed Wingfield and elected John Ratcliffe president, but the latter was little better than King Log. They lived on fish and crabs until September, when they managed to get some corn from the Indians. Instead of arriving in time to clear fields and plant crops in the spring and raise some provisions as they had expected, by ill luck and folly combined, they were 5 months upon the voyage, consuming their provisions. Nearly all the men were unused to labour, and the necessary work in building their houses and planting their stockade in such a burning sun as they had never seen in England had broken them down. Then chills and fever from malaria and bowel complaints from bad food and water seized upon them and carried off more than half their number. Death had been more certain because many of them had for years lived dissipated and reckless lives. From the incompetence of the rest of the council, Smith had to bear the brunt of everything. When he was at the settlement, he was constantly urging the lazy fellows, who had never before done a day's manual labour, to the rude toil, always taking the heavy end of every task himself. Much of the time he was away, striving to get corn from the Indians. Returning from one of these expeditions, he found Wingfield and Kendall, another of the council, with some others, about to desert with the pinnace, a little vessel of 20 tons which had been left for the use of the colonists. Smith promptly fired upon them with cannon and muskets, killing Kendall and forcing the others to return or be sunk in the river. With the approach of winter, the rivers were swarming with wild geese and ducks, which with the Indian corn gave the colonists good fare. Not satisfied, the council began to tax Smith with being slow to discover the head of the Chickahominy River. What they wanted with the head of that river it is hard to tell, but Smith, to satisfy them, set out to find it. Venturing too far alone, he was captured by the Indians and held prisoner 6 or 7 weeks. By his courage and address he not only saved his life, but was enabled to obtain his freedom and greatly enhance his reputation and influence among the savages, much to the advantage of the colony. He had just returned from this captivity when the ship returned from England. On his return he found that things had gone very badly in his absence. "And now, Captain Newport," said Smith in conclusion, "what sort of fellows have you brought us this time? Good, stout, honest labourers and mechanics, or like the first lot, jailbirds and gentlemen? Most of the latter little more honest and a good deal more lazy than the former." "Not what I could wish, I must confess," said Newport. "I fear too many of them are unruly gallants packed off by their relatives to escape ill destinies at home." And so, to the misfortune of the colony, they were. Among the 70 passengers streaming across that improvised bridge from the ship to the shore, eager to press foot upon the soil of the New World, was one who will soon become the central figure of this narrative. His name was Ralph Morton. He was hardly 20 years old, of medium size but strongly built, and, unlike too many of those immigrants, with a constitution not undermined by any vice. He was the 4th son of a Kentish gentleman who had been killed in the war with Spain about the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign. His home was near the mouth of the Thames. Having in early childhood shown a great aptitude for learning, it was intended that he should be a physician. He had learned all that could be taught in the village school, and from such tutors as could be obtained in his native village. His father's death left his mother in such straitened circumstances that she could not send him to college, so he was sent to London to live with his brother-in-law and pick up what learning he could from the libraries to which he had access, and from such occasional tutoring as he could get. This brother-in-law, a native of Ralph's village, had married Ralph's only sister, several years older than Ralph, before he had determined to convert his country property into money and abandon the dull and unprofitable life of a country gentleman for the career of a London merchant, although in that age a gentleman was considered as losing caste by going into trade. Ralph learned Latin quickly, but he had little taste for Greek and spent little time upon it. The education of that time in England consisted almost altogether of the languages and theology. To the latter Ralph had a great aversion, and avoided it entirely. Most of the books of that age in the English language were devoted to theological controversy. The bulk of what Ralph considered worth knowing was in Latin, French, and Italian. There were also many valuable books of travel in the Spanish language, which Ralph desired to read. With a good knowledge of Latin, enough French, Spanish, and Italian to enable him to read fluently was quickly learned. He could find about London enough Huguenot refugees and Spanish sailors from whom to learn the spoken French and Spanish. Thus equipped, he read everything he could find in the way of history, travels, and natural science. The sciences, even mathematics, were then at a very low ebb in England, and little taught. Even the great Bacon was ignorant of geometry. But Ralph found a Genoese tutor in London, and made good progress in mathematics and astronomy. Finally, being overcome with that irresistible desire for adventure which often seizes upon even the most studious of youths, he had become an emigrant to Virginia. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Aristopia by Castello, Newton Holford. Captain Newport was not only a member of the Colonial Council, but as the medium of communication between the Virginia Company in London and the Council at Jamestown, he enjoyed particular importance. Even Captain Smith, so imperious with the rest, deferred much more to Newport than to the President of the Council, and represented him to the Indians as his father. Newport very much desired to conciliate the great chief of that region, whom the English called King Powhatan. By the way, the name Powhatan was not only the name of the chief, but the Indian name for the whole region and its inhabitants, and for the river which the English called the James. Newport did not like Smith's masterful way of acquiring ascendancy over the Indians, but thought liberal and ostentatious presents the best way. Immediately on his arrival he sent by messenger some presents to Powhatan, and as soon as the pinnace could be got ready in a style to suit his ideas, he set out to visit the great chief, taking with him Captain Smith and Matthew Scrivener, who had just come over and had immediately been elected a member of the council, and a party of 40 men, of whom Ralph Morton was one. Powhatan's residence was at Werowocomoco on the Pamunkey River, since called the York, only 12 miles from Jamestown overland, but Newport concluded to go by water. Arrived near the Indian town, Newport's heart failed him as he thought of trusting himself among the warriors of the redoubtable chief. Smith, to reassure him, landed with 20 men, among them Morton, and proceeded to Powhatan's village, which was some distance from the river. There were some small but deep and miry creeks to cross, over which the Indians had made frail bridges composed of poles laid in crotches stuck in the mire. These Smith suspected to be traps, but was reassured by making some of his Indian guides go over them first. arrived at the village, 200 or 300 savages conducted the Englishmen into Powhatan's presence. The chief had arranged his greatest pomp for the occasion. He was seated on a bed of mats with a leather pillow embroidered with pearls and beads made of bits of shell. He was attired in a robe of furs. At each side, close by him, sat one of the fairest of his harem, and farther away 20 of his women, their faces and arms stained red with pecony root, and about their necks great chains of shell beads. As an emblem of his hospitality, 40 wooden platters full of corn bread were arranged in 2 rows, one on each side of the door. Powhatan caused a proclamation to be made that on pain of death none was to molest any of his guests. The acquaintance begun between Smith and the chief during the former's captivity was renewed in a long conversation. Then the chief entertained his guests with the dancing and barbarous dramatic performances of his women, and with a feast, and gave them lodging for the night. The next day Newport, being informed that all was well, came ashore. The party spent 3 or 4 days at the place. Usually the Indian chiefs would not allow their men to trade with the whites until they, the chiefs, had done their trading. But this time Powhatan would not trade until the last. Then he said to Newport, through Smith as interpreter, "It does not befit my greatness to haggle with you about each separate trifle. Lay all your goods in a heap, and I will take what pleases me, and give you what I think it is worth." "A right royal trader is this," said Smith, with a twinkle of the eye. "He will please himself, I assure you, but the trade he will make you will little pleasure or advantage you. Rather put the boot on the other leg. Tell the cunning old rascal to measure out 20 hogsheads of corn, and you will give him such trinkets as you think is right." "Nay, nay," said Newport, "rather let us outbrave the barbarian with the greatness of our generosity, and so bewitch him with our bounty as we may have what we list of his." "Not at all," said Smith. "You will find the savage's desire unsatiable. You will give him such a conceit of himself as will make him think himself everything and us nothing." But Newport gave the chief his way, and the latter helped himself liberally to the English goods, and gave in return about 4 bushels of corn. Newport, who had expected enough to supply his whole colony, looked aghast. "Corn were better cheap in Spain," said Smith dryly. Then, as if carelessly, he let the chief see some bright blue beads, and, in answer to the chief's inquiry, informed him that such ornaments were only for great kings, and that he would not part with them, as he wanted to keep them for the kings of the Monacans and Massawamecs, mortal enemies of the Powhatans. In the end, the old chief became so determined to have the beads that he gave about 250 bushels of corn for them. Leaving Powhatan, Newport's party visited Opachancana, Powhatan's brother, who ruled over the Pamunkeys, and supplied him and his harem with these royal blue beads for a large amount of corn, and then returned to Jamestown with their supply. The newcomers were quartered in the cabins with the first settlers, whose number had been so thinned by death. For a while they were quite comfortable, in spite of the extreme cold weather. But one night some of the roistering gallants got to throwing firebrands around, and set fire to one of the thatched roofs. In a few minutes the little village was in a raging conflagration. Every house was burned, and the stockade was destroyed in many places. Some even lost their bedding in the confusion. Ralph Morton was well supplied with blankets, and had presence of mind enough to get them out of the burning cabin, and to carry them and his little chest down to the water's edge to escape the intense heat. But his little shelf of books was destroyed. The chaplain of the colony, Mr. Robert Hunt, had a considerable library which was destroyed, to his great grief, and not a little to Ralph's sorrow, as the good parson was almost as much pleased to loan the books to Ralph as to use them himself. Fortunately, most of the corn remained still in the pinnace, and most of the stores in the ship, or the colony would soon have starved outright. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. With as much promptness as possible, Captain Smith, the rest of the council seeming paralysed by the catastrophe, got the men at work to rebuild the houses and palisade. Chopping was new and at first very severe work for Ralph, but he was wise enough not to overwork till he was somewhat inured to the toil. His hands soon became so stiff and blistered that each morning when he grasped his axe handle anew, it seemed that the torture was more than he could bear. There were 2 young gallants of the first supply, whose jewelled fingers had never held anything rougher than a bridle rein, and were much more dexterous with cards than with any useful tool. Almost every blow these fellows dealt with their smarting hands was accompanied with an oath. Captain Smith, although bred in camps, being a man who had religion much at heart, was much offended at this profanity, and at last told the offenders that for every oath they should have a can of cold water poured down their sleeves. He carried out his threat, or at least a part of it, and the 2 gallants swore no more above their breath. In a few weeks, such was their spirit, they became pretty fair woodsmen, and loved almost as much to make the tall trees come thundering down as in England they had loved to ride to the death of the fox. But there were few of their spirit among that band. Ralph was industrious and determined, but he had not the high and reckless spirit of the 2 gallants. At first the shelterless men suffered much at night from the cold. Ralph and a chosen comrade, out of work hours, soon constructed a shelter of brush, and provided a good bed of leaves gathered in the woods. They had to watch closely to keep their blankets from being stolen. Towards spring, a bed of sand heavily charged with powdered iron pyrites was discovered near the village. The glittering stuff was supposed to be gold, and immediately the little colony went wild. Fortunately their cabins had been rebuilt, or they would have neglected that necessary task to gather gold. There were 3 or 4 of the first supply who had come out as refiners, and these were the craziest of the lot. There was no talk but of digging gold, washing gold, refining gold, and loading gold. There were only 2 men in the community whose heads were not turned. They were Smith and Morton. The latter had learned something about minerals, and pronounced the stuff sulphuret of iron, much to the disgust of the self-styled refiners. Captain John Martin, one of the council, was the discoverer of the mine, and the leader of the gold hunters. One day Smith broke out upon him, "I tell you, man, I am tormented as never before to see all necessary business neglected to load your crazy ship with this gilded dirt. I applaud not your golden inventions, not because you do not admit me to a sight of your trials and golden consultations, you and these loud-mouthed refiners who I doubt ever refined anything, but because in all this time they have not been able to show me a more substantial token, and turn out something which looks as if it might make a sovereign or a golden ring instead of mere dross. I am not enamoured of such dirty skill." At last the ship was laden with the glittering dust, and 14 weeks after her arrival she departed. With her departed 2 of the council, Wingfield and Archer, who had arrogated to themselves a number of pompous titles, but were despised by the colonists, who gladly saw them go. Through Newport Sloth the ship had lain so long that her crew had eaten up a large part of what was intended for the colonists. Smith had been a careful trader with the Indians, but Newport was a reckless prodigal and loaded them with gifts until they scorned to give anything in trade. But before this the sailors and soldiers had been allowed to trade freely with the Indians, and they embezzled much of the stores in illicit traffic. Some favourite of the company had set up a tavern for the sale of victuals and drink, and, as one colonist wrote home, those that had either money, spare clothes, or credit to give bills of payment, gold rings, furs, or any such commodities, were ever welcome to this removing tavern, and we might buy our own provisions at 15 times the value. This tavern seems to have much resembled the sutler tent of a modern army. Smith and Scrivener did their best, but the majority of the council seemed possessed by the demon of folly, and overruled all wise counsels. Through exposure while houseless, but much more through their folly and recklessness, nearly half of the colonists died between the arrival of the Seagull and that of the Phoenix. Ralph Morton, by his prudent care of himself, kept in good health. The colonists were made to labour on the public works only 6 hours a day, and Ralph soon became inured to this. Much of his spare time was spent in learning the language of the Powhatans. He first learned what he could from Captain Smith, and especially that key to learning of those who understand nothing of the learner's language, the question, "What do you call this?" in the Powhatan language. "Kakatora wines diowo." Then he took for his teacher an Indian boy whom Powhatan had given as hostage to Newport on the latter's visit to Werowocomoco. This boy's name was Namontack, and he was a shrewd and intelligent fellow. The colonists succeeded in getting about 30 acres cleared and planted in good season with Indian corn. Near the end of corn planting the Phoenix arrived, bringing about 50 new immigrants. When she had parted company with her consort off the Capes, she had been blown far southward, and had put into a port of the West Indies for repairs. Being in bad condition, these repairs took considerable time, but she reached Jamestown without the loss of a man. Her arrival cheered the unfortunate colony considerably. Captain Martin desired to lade this ship with his supposed gold, but Smith prevailed and had her loaded with cedar. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. On the 2nd of June, 1608, the Phoenix left Jamestown for England, taking with her John Smith and a party of 14 men, among them Ralph Morton, who went to explore the Chesapeake by order of the company, who hoped to find a passage to the South Sea. At the Capes of the Chesapeake, Captain Smith's party left the Phoenix and set out on their voyage in an open barge of 3 tons, rigged with a mast and sail. They sailed up the eastern side of the bay, first visiting the Indian village of Accomac, where they were very kindly treated. While exploring some little islands in the bay, they were caught in a violent storm of thunder and lightning, with such gusts of wind that they were well nigh shipwrecked. Returning to the eastern shore of the bay, they put into a little river called Werowocomoco to obtain fresh water. As they came near the shore, the savages gathered on the banks with demonstrations of furious hostility, but in a little while became very friendly. The water found there was muddy, warm, and brackish, and far from refreshing. However, the party filled their water vessels with it, and set off to visit some small islands in the bay. Again a violent storm burst upon them, with such a gust of wind that their sail was rent and their mast carried overboard. Managing with difficulty to land on one of the little islands, hardly more than a mudbank, they were forced by a remarkable succession of storms to remain 2 days. Smith called the little group of islands Limbo, as being something between purgatory and the infernal regions. Such a name applied by an old campaigner inured to all hardships is very suggestive of what the party endured during those 2 days. They utilised the time to some extent by patching up their sail with such parts of their shirts as they could spare with least inconvenience. Sailing back to the mainland on the eastern shore of the bay, the party entered the little river Cuscaraweoc. There they found the natives so persistently hostile that Captain Smith ordered his men to give them a volley. Some of the savages were apparently wounded, and their consternation was great. They tumbled into the grass and wriggled away like snakes. Going ashore, Captain Smith and his party entered some of the houses of the natives, and left there some small pieces of copper, some beads, and 2 or 3 little bells. This combination of bullets and presents seemed to have a mollifying effect on the savages, as the next day they were very friendly, crowding around Smith and his men and offering them all sorts of services. All the Indians encountered on this voyage told the whites about the Massawomecs, a fierce and powerful tribe who dwelt beyond the mountains to the west, but made numerous forays upon the Indians of the Tidewater region, carrying off many women as captives. They importuned Smith to assist them in driving off the Massawomecs, and Smith promised to do so after he had attended to some other matters. The natives of the low country about the Waikokomoko were small and low of stature. The water was so poor on the eastern side of the bay that Captain Smith determined to cross over to the western side, the bold shores of which could be dimly seen through the haze of distance low upon the horizon. They found the western shore rough and barren, but with plenty of good water. Sailing up this shore, they came to a broad estuary, the mouth of a navigable river, which Smith called the Bolus, from the resemblance of the earth on its banks to a drug then in use for making a bolus. This river was afterward called the Patapsco. The explorers were detained here 3 days by bad weather and strong north winds. Their bread had been wet during storms they had encountered, when their boat was at times nearly filled with water. They had no luck in killing game, and had neglected to bring along any kind of apparatus for catching fish. The bad and scanty food, and the exposure to the storms in their little open boat, caused several of the men to fall sick. Nearly all of them importuned Captain Smith to return to Jamestown. Ralph Morton, still well, cheerful, and courageous, was almost alone in sustaining the captain in the resolution to push on and complete their explorations of the bay. Smith strongly objected to returning. He reminded his men how the company of Ralph Lane, in their explorations of the Roanoke River, had urged their leader to go forward, saying that they had still a dog which, boiled with sassafras leaves for sauce, would richly feed them until they could finish their journey, although they had not a mouthful of bread. "But we have no dog," said one of the men. "But we have plenty of bread," returned the captain, "albeit somewhat mouldy. I charge you, gentlemen, to remember that in setting out you were suspicious of my tenderness, thinking I would be for turning back, while you would be all for going on. I have shared with you the worst thus far. It is unlikely worse is to come. This is my 2nd summer in Virginia, and I never saw such a continuance of storms as we have weathered. You may expect a long period of fair weather now. For what is to come, whether it be weather or diet or whatsoever, I am contented to take the worst. Do you lack shelter at night? Take my blanket. Is the bread bad? Take the best and leave the mouldiest for me. As for your fears that I will lose myself in these great unknown waters, or that we shall be swallowed in some stormy gust, abandon them. They are childish. I have found and fought my way through the wildernesses of all 4 quarters of the globe, and am now hale and sound. It would be a shame for you to force me to return now, when we are scarce able to say where we have been, and have not yet heard of what we were sent to seek. Regain, therefore, your old spirits with which you set out, for return I will not until I have seen the Massawomecks, found Patawomeck, or the head of this water which you conceit to be endless." But the pitiful complaints of the sick men finally prevailed on Smith to turn the head of the barge southward when they left Bowler's Harbour. At their first landing to pass the night, they killed a deer, which greatly bettered their fare and revived their spirits. The weather was now very pleasant. Proceeding southward, the party soon came to the mouth of a river, or estuary, 7 miles broad, which the Indians called Patawomeck. By this time the sick men were better, and the others had recovered their spirits, and were willing to explore this great river. So they sailed up it for days, finding no current to impede them. They found the Indians on its banks uniformly friendly. Though not of the tribe of Powhatan, they had been subjugated by that chief. Their native language was not the Powhatan language, but as in every village were persons who in their youth had lived as hostages with the great chief and learned the language of his tribe, Smith and Morton easily communicated with them. At last, after passing a considerable branch coming in on the north-eastern side, they found the river quite narrow, and soon came to some rapids over which they could not get their barge. Passing the night at the mouth of a creek about a mile below the foot of the rapids and the head of tidewater, Smith set out on foot in the morning with 8 men to explore the river for some distance above the rapids. Ralph Morton was among the 6 left with the boat. Smith instructed them not to wander away from the boat. However, as Ralph had developed considerable skill in marksmanship and had shown himself careful and trustworthy, Smith gave him permission to go out a short distance for a hunt, cautioning him to look out for Indians. Ralph shouldered his musket and strolled off up the creek, with eyes and ears alert for game or Indians. He was strong and nimble of foot, and he went much farther than he intended. As he ascended the creek, the region became picturesquely hilly, and in some places cliffs of dark rock towered up far above the rippling waters. He saw no game worth shooting at within good range. At last he heard the cry of a wild turkey gobbler, which he had learned to distinguish, up on the hill away from the creek. Cautiously going toward the sound, he soon came in sight of a fine gobbler strutting up and down a fallen log in a little open space within fair range. Ralph took careful aim and fired, putting a ball through the base of the turkey's neck. Picking up his game, he turned back toward the creek, but as he was rather tired, he concluded to rest a little, and sat down on a dyke of quartz which barely projected above the thin soil. The sun was getting high, and a beam came down through a rift in the foliage high above, falling upon the dyke near Ralph. He gazed idly at the bright spot on the ground. At last he became aware of a tiny sparkle between the white fragments of quartz. He soon became curious about it, and on examination found it came from a scratch on a lump of something, the upper surface of which was visible above the earth. With the point of his knife he pried out the lump, which was of the bulk of an orange, but of irregular shape. Ralph was surprised at its weight. He scratched it with his knife. There was no further doubt. Its lustre and weight proclaimed it solid gold. For a few moments Ralph was almost stupefied with his emotions. Then he fell eagerly at work, scraping away with his hands and the blade of his large sheath knife the thin earth that covered the quartz ledge. In doing so he came upon several other lumps of gold, one a little larger and the others smaller than the first one. He cut a stout sapling and sharpened the end of the stick to make a crowbar, with which he pried away a few pieces of the quartz, which was much fissured. After a while he exposed the top of a piece of gold that was 4 or 5 inches across, but it was immovable, and he could not tell to what depth it extended. Being very weary, he stopped work, and as he rested he reflected. His first impulse was to rush away and inform his companions of his incredible discovery, but after a while he thought he would keep it secret. If he could form some scheme to get control of all this wealth, how much more good he could, and he thought he would, do with it than would that dissolute and worthless crowd at Jamestown, or that company of selfish merchants in London. He found that the lumps he had already procured weighed 15 pounds or more, and he reflected that such an amount was about all he could carry with him and keep concealed on his person, and even that amount would be very burdensome. He quickly calculated the probable value of 15 pounds of gold, and found it was enough, if he could get back to England with it, to charter a barque and come over and get the rest of the gold, however much there might be. It required no small resolution to leave that glittering mass of untold value there in the earth and go back to Jamestown. But at last Ralph carefully replaced the loose earth upon the golden mass, gathered some stones and placed over it, scraped up some dead leaves from some distance away, and scattered them over the rocks, hoping to conceal the gold from any straggling Indian who might pass the spot. Then, stowing away his nuggets in his clothes as best he could, he set out on his return to the boat, which was about 3 miles away. With a pocket compass he carefully took the bearings of his mine from the creek. On a large tree near the bank of the creek he cut some marks and took some mental notes of the surroundings, which he reduced to writing at the first opportunity. He did not care to look for game, but when within about half a mile of the boat, another turkey offered so fair a mark that he shot it. Tying the necks of the 2 birds together, he slung them over his shoulder and was soon among his companions, who were becoming uneasy at his long absence. Having some needles and thread with him, with a strip of tanned deerskin which he had procured from the Indians, he made him a belt with pockets to contain his gold. As soon as he could do so without being observed, he put his gold in the belt and fastened it about his waist under his clothes. Smith and his companions returned toward evening, and reported that above the rapids the river ran through a rather narrow valley, and was in some places skirted by high cliffs, and that it was not navigable. In that region there was much mica in the rocks and earth, in small glittering particles. It looked so much like silver that even the cautious Smith was half deceived, and had gathered some of it to send to England for assay. Morton pronounced it mica, and Smith said with a sigh, "Well, it may be. I would we had some with us who knew a mine from spar." As the tide was beginning to ebb, the party, to take advantage of it, started down the river that evening. Smith saw some Indians painted with some substance which, as he said, made them look like blackamoors dusted over with silver. They told him where they got it, and he went to find the mine. About 30 miles below the rapids, a small but navigable river which the Indians called the Quijo empties into the Patawomeck. The party rowed as far as they could get the boat up this river. Then Smith with 6 men set out on foot, leaving Ralph Morton with the other men in charge of the boat. The deposit of match quion, as the Indians called the mineral, was 7 or 8 miles from where Smith left the boat. In due time he returned with a considerable quantity of the stuff, which he thought was antimony, but Ralph believed it to be plumbago. Proceeding down the river and bay to the mouth of the Rappahannock, Smith intended to explore that river, but as the tide ebbed, their barge grounded on a bar. while waiting for the tide to come in, Smith amused himself by spearing with his sword the fish lying in the shallow water among the reeds. He caught many fish, among them a stingaree, which gave him a wound which made him so extremely sick that his party expected him to die. In a few hours he felt better, but was so far from well that he concluded to go to Jamestown. The party arrived there on the 21st of July. They found many of the colonists sick, and, as their chronicler wrote, all unable to do anything but complain of the pride and unreasonable, needless cruelty of the silly President that had riotously consumed the store, and to fulfil his follies about building him an unnecessary palace for his pleasure in the woods, had brought them all to that misery. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. Resting at Jamestown only 2 days, Smith set out in his barge on the 24th of July to finish his exploration. He took a party of 12 with him, the majority of whom had been on his first expedition. Ralph Morton disliked either to leave his gold in Jamestown or carry it on his person, but he had been so useful to Captain Smith that the latter was bent on having him of the company. So Ralph put the gold in his chest, which was strong and well locked, and left it in charge of the young man he had chosen for his comrade. As no ship was expected in for several weeks, he knew he should not, by going with Smith, miss an opportunity of returning to England. Descending the James River, the party was detained 2 or 3 days at Kickertan, an Indian village near the mouth of the river. After dark one evening, Smith fired a few rockets. These missiles, rushing on their fiery course into the sky, greatly frightened the savages, who supposed the whites to be some sort of gods. They implored Smith to destroy the Massawomecs. The explorers sailed directly up the bay until they saw it divide. They explored 2 of the branches on the western side without finding any river of importance. Then, in crossing, the party encountered a fleet of 7 or 8 canoes full of Indians who appeared to be preparing for fight. An epidemic had fallen on the explorers, so that only 5 of them could stand. The others lay under the shade of the tarpaulin. Smith set up their hats on sticks to look like men. He then fired 2 or 3 muskets, so that the bullets went skipping over the water close to the canoes. The noise and the long range of the bullets frightened the Indians, who pulled their canoes into the shore with all speed. They landed and awaited the approach of the barge, whose great size seemed to awe them somewhat. Smith made signs of friendship, and at last 2 of the Indians ventured to come on board the barge. Their fellows followed them within bowshot to assist them at need. Each of the 2 ambassadors was presented with a bell. They then returned and brought on board the whole Indian party, who gave the whites venison, bear meat, and fish in return for a few beads. The Indians proved to be the renowned Massawomecs. They were of the same tribe which the French called the Iroquois, and the English afterward knew in New York as the 5 Nations. Although esteemed by the other Indian tribes as so bold and invincible that they made war with all the world, they dared not encounter the English muskets. Their canoes were not dugouts like those of the Tidewater Indians, but were made of birch bark. As they did not understand the Powhatan language, the communication between the 2 parties was by signs. They signified that they had lately attacked the Toquas, a tribe living in that neighbourhood, and showed some fresh wounds they had received. Smith purchased some of their bows, arrows, and targets, which were of a peculiar pattern. Night coming on, the Massawomecs retired to camp, and the whites saw them no more. They were evidently not fond of the company of such mysterious beings as the whites seemed to be. Entering the river Tocqua, the explorers encountered the tribe on which the party of Massawomex had lately made an attack. One of this tribe could speak the language of Powhatan, and a friendly parley ensued. When the Toquas saw the well-known and dreaded weapons of the Massawomex in the hands of the English, they supposed the weapons had been captured in battle, and their admiration of the whites was greatly increased. They welcomed the explorers with the greatest hospitality. Their town was palisaded with considerable skill as a defence against the attacks of the Massawomex. Smith found among these Indians some articles which had evidently come from the French traders on the St. Lawrence, having passed from tribe to tribe in exchange. Finding the mouth of the Susquehanna, the explorers ascended that river until they came to a place where the stream, although very broad, was too shallow to float the barge. On this river the explorers found a tribe of Indians called the Susquehannocks, whose great size astonished Smith. They were mild and friendly. They, too, had suffered much from the forays of the Massawomex. Sailing down the bay, our party explored the Patuxent River, and then entered the Rappahannock. At an Indian village near the mouth of the latter river, the party found one who seemed to them like an old friend, an Indian named Moscow, whom they had first encountered far up the Patawomeck, and who had been their guide to the mine of the substance which Smith supposed to be antimony. Learning that the party proposed to go up the Rappahannock, Moscow at first endeavoured to dissuade them by telling them of the fierce and implacable nature of the Indians far up the river, but afterward attached himself to the party and accompanied them on all their explorations of this river. He was quite useful. The explorers found that the Rappahannocks were indeed a fierce and treacherous tribe. Smith's party had several fights with these savages. The latter would ambush themselves on the margin of the river by holding before them branches of trees which they had broken off. In one of these encounters Ralph Morton, who had left the boat and gone out for a parley, received a severe arrow wound in the fleshy part of the right arm. Leaving the Rappahannock, the party went to explore the south end of the Chesapeake. While they were out on the broad bay at night, a sudden storm arose, and the barge was driven before a terrible gale, the waves sweeping over her, and the crew having to bail with all their might to keep from foundering. The frequent flashes of lightning illumined the black night, and by this light they were finally enabled to run into shelter at Point Comfort. The next day the indefatigable Smith set off to explore the little bays of Nunsemond and Norfolk. This done, he had demonstrated beyond a doubt that there was no passage out of the Chesapeake into the South Sea, which passage the London Company was very anxious to have found, and which discovery was the principal object of all these explorations. A hostile encounter with the Nansemond Indians ended in the two parties becoming good friends, and Smith loaded his barge with corn obtained from the Nansemonds by barter and set sail for Jamestown. Captain Smith, although of a very grave and serious disposition, showed his love of a practical joke by decking out the barge with pieces of coloured cloth brought along for barter, in imitation of Spanish flags. These being seen far down the river, the colony at Jamestown supposed that a Spanish pirate was coming, and were greatly frightened. They had from the first settlement feared a visit from the Spaniards. Thus, on the 7th of September ended those remarkable explorations, in which a small party had made voyages aggregating 3,000 miles in an open boat in an unusually stormy season, exposed without shelter to the fierce heat of the midday sun and the chill of the rainy night. At the end of his voyages, Ralph Morton, at 20 years of age, felt himself a veteran. During both of these voyages Ralph took observations, from which he drew a map, a copy of which he gave to Captain Smith, who sent it to England. Long afterward Smith had much credit for the remarkable accuracy of the map, considering the circumstances of its production. The party, on reaching Jamestown, found the colony doing somewhat better than before under the presidency of Scrivener, the wretched Ratcliffe having been deposed and imprisoned for his lawless excesses. On the 10th of September Smith was elected president at the request of the company, and things mended still more. About this time Newport arrived from England with orders from the company not to return without a lump of gold, the discovery of a passage to the South Sea, or finding one of the lost companies sent out by Walter Raleigh, all of which conditions Captain Smith laughed to scorn. Newport brought a boat, built in sections, to be carried around the falls of the James, in the effort to discover a passage to the South Sea. He spent some time in a fruitless effort to explore the upper James, and still more in an expedition for the silly ceremony of crowning Powhatan as a vassal king of King James. Smith, railing at the folly, was compelled by the company to assist in it. Newport's evil influence was again felt so much that Smith was eager to load his ship and pack him off to England. Under ordinary circumstances it would have been impossible for Ralph Morton to have obtained permission to go to England. Most of the colony would have gone in a body if Smith had allowed them. However, Ralph's wound became much worse. His system was in that condition popularly known as the blood out of order, which is common to people the first year of their residence in a strange climate. His arm was much swollen and inflamed, but though it had an alarming look, it was not very painful, and he made more ado about it than was necessary. He was unable to work, and spent most of his time with Namontauk, learning the Powhatan language, of which he composed a vocabulary and grammar. Being very frugal and careful, he had some money left, with which he offered to pay his passage home, saying if he did not get better surgical treatment for his wound than he could get in Jamestown, it might kill him. On one account Smith was willing to let Ralph go. He knew that Ralph's brother-in-law was a member of the company and a personal friend of the treasurer. He desired to send a letter to the treasurer, stating plainly the bad management of the colony. He meant to scorn Newport severely, and so he did not wish to entrust Newport with the letter. Knowing that Ralph quite agreed with him in his opinion of the way things were going, he resolved to make the young man his messenger. So it was that one Indian summer day, about 11 months after Ralph first set foot in Jamestown, he left it for ever, with his little chest and its precious contents. That winter voyage was a stormy one, although not a very long one, as the storms came from the west. On the tossing ship, amid the howling tempests, the young adventurer had no fears. His fancy saw a destiny for him too great to be swallowed up in a tempest. Caesar said to the frightened boatman in the storm, "Quid times? Caesarem vehis et fortunas suas." Ralph Morton could say with equal confidence that the little ship carried greater fortunes than those of Caesar, for he was about to influence the world's history more than did Caesar. And it is doubtful if Caesar did change the current of history much beyond his lifetime. Gaul and Britain would have been conquered without him, and perhaps at the expense of the same lives and treasure which he squandered in his struggle with Pompey, and his partisans spent in their struggle with Brutus and Cassius. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. Arrived in London, Ralph quickly disposed of his gold to the goldsmiths for about £750 sterling. He then sought and found a vessel which he could charter for a voyage, a small bark of 30 tons, whose captain and owner was ready for a venture. When Ralph told him he wanted to go to Virginia for a cargo of sassafras wood and furs, the captain honestly advised him to get a larger vessel, as his little bark could not carry wood enough for a profitable voyage. But Ralph could not afford to hire, and did not need a large vessel. The captain agreed to furnish the crew and make the voyage for £300, provided he should make it in 4 months, which he was sure he could do with fair winds, as he knew the short route. He wanted £75 a month added for every month of the voyage beyond 4, but Ralph feared if he made such a bargain the captain would purposely prolong the voyage. Finally the captain agreed to make the trip for £350, 200 to be paid in advance for furnishing the vessel. Considering the great value of money at that time, when the ordinary wages of a seaman was 8d. a day, and everything else in proportion, Captain Nelson did not make a bad bargain. As before said, Ralph's brother-in-law, John Somers, was a personal acquaintance of the treasurer of the Virginia Company, as well as a member of the company, and through his influence Ralph readily got a licence to make a voyage to Virginia to trade, on condition of giving 2.5% of the value of his cargo to the company. Ralph's next oldest brother, Henry, had been a soldier since the age of 18, at first in the war between England and Spain, and afterwards fighting for the Dutch against the Spaniards in Flanders. He was now at home, and Ralph engaged him to make the voyage to Virginia. Ralph's brother next younger than himself, Charles, was now 19. Ralph engaged him also, promising to pay him well, although Charles would have been glad to go to America without promise of pay. Captain Nelson furnished his bark himself. Ralph, besides his private provisions and outfit, laid in a stock to traffic with the Indians: small mirrors, small cheap pocket-knives, glass beads, red cloth, sheets of polished brass and copper which he cut in small pieces, fish-hooks, etc. So energetically did he work that by the 20th of March 1609 the bark was ready to sail. Dropping down to the mouth of the Thames, they waited there a few days for a fair wind, Ralph fortunately being able to spend the time at his home. The voyage out was a good one. Captain Nelson knew his business, and the winds were not contrary, so that in 48 days after leaving the Straits of Dover our adventurers passed between the capes of the Chesapeake. Entering the Patawomeck, afterwards known as the Potomac, which name we shall hereafter use, Ralph stopped at the several Indian villages, bought what furs and skins the Indians had, and told them he would be back in 10 or 12 days, and would take all they could provide by that time. The last village to be passed on the river was that of the Nacotchtanks, about 10 miles below the mouth of the creek on which was the gold mine. Ralph particularly wished to gain the friendship of these Indians and impress them with his power. So, after trading with them, he gave their chief some particularly fine ornaments, in the chief's opinion, as presents. On the vessel was a small cannon. This was carefully aimed at a tree near by on the river bank, and discharged. At the thunderous sound, the Indians, who were gathered on the bank, fell upon their faces, and it took several minutes to persuade them that they were neither hurt nor going to be hurt. When they saw how the cannon ball had shattered the tree like a thunderbolt, they were little less astonished than at the sound. Ralph felt confident that the Nacotchtanks would not molest him. Leaving this village, before night the vessel anchored in the mouth of the creek, which Ralph, in memory of the cliffs he had seen along it, named Rock Creek. That night he hid in the bushes a small shovel and a pick. The next morning he gave directions to the captain to set the crew at work cutting such sassafras trees as grew near the river or creek for loading the bark. By the help of small boats, the timber could be floated on the river or creek to the side of the vessel for loading. He had brought along a stout ass, which he told Captain Nelson could be used that day in dragging the wood to the water's edge. By the way, sassafras wood was then in great demand in England for cabinet making. In good season in the morning, Ralph set out for his mine, leaving his brothers to assist in loading the vessel. He was armed with his musket, sword, and pistols. he carried the pick and shovel before mentioned, and in a large leather pouch slung over his shoulder with a stout strap he carried, among other things, a small sledge and 2 gads or steel wedges with which miners split rock. He found the place he sought with little difficulty. It had not been molested. After a short rest, for his journey and his burden had tired him, he set to work. With the shovel he removed the dirt from the ledge for a space of 5 or 6 feet square, and put it carefully in a pile. Then, with his pick and gads, he attacked the quartz dyke that surrounded the gold. The quartz was much cracked and fissured, and its removal was not difficult. He soon uncovered 3 masses of gold, 5 or 6 inches thick and 8 or 9 inches in length horizontally. They were shaped like human heads. Digging down a foot or more, he found that the 3 masses were attached below by necks to one still larger mass. These heads were separated from each other by a few inches of broken quartz. He also found another lump of about 25 pounds weight attached by a slender neck to the mass. This neck he cut through with his knife and a gad, and put the lump in his pouch. He also found a number of detached lumps, varying in size from a pigeon's egg to an orange. At noon he built a little fire at which he broiled some meat, and made a dinner of meat and bread he had brought in his pouch. By careful measurements and calculations he determined that he would have to cut each of the 3 masses or heads in 2 before he could handle them alone. He must work alone, for he concluded to keep the mine a secret even from his brothers for a time. At first he had thought of sharing the mine with them, but as the possible vastness of the wealth occurred to him, certain vague plans began to outline themselves in his mind, plans for changing the face of a considerable part of the world, plans in which he wanted no equal partners, for he knew not how far he could trust even his brothers. When the evening sun was about 2 hours high, Ralph hid the small pieces of gold and his gads under the stones, and his pick, shovel, and sledge in the creek, and started for the vessel. That large lump of gold was all he wanted to carry over that rough path. The next morning he took the ass with him, provided with a pack-saddle. He also took a box, a short saw, a thin flat chisel, and a small crowbar. Arriving at the mine, he set to work with the saw to split one of the heads perpendicularly. He placed a cloth so as to catch the sawdust and save it. When he had cut down to the smallest part of the neck, he cut 1/2 of the head loose with the chisel and sledge. Then he brought forth the box. He knew that if he filled a box with gold, the extraordinary weight would betray the nature of the contents, so he had made a number of strong boxes about 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 6 inches deep, each with 3 compartments, the middle one about 6 inches wide. Into the middle compartment he placed the great mass of gold, and blocked it around tightly with pieces of wood. Each of the 3 compartments was provided with a false floor about 1 inch from the top. This little space Ralph intended to fill with the micaceous earth, so that he could open the box and allow anyone to inspect it and find it apparently filled with the earth. Ralph was young and strong, but he found it a hard lift to place the box with the gold on the ass. This done, he tied the box firmly to the pack-saddle, put in his pouch the little lumps of gold he had found the day before, and started for the vessel. Altogether it was the hardest day's work he ever did in his life. In the 3 succeeding days he finished splitting the other 2 masses or heads, and cutting them loose from the underlying mass, bringing home a piece with him each day. By weighing them in his room in the bark, he found that the 6 large pieces and the several smaller ones would aggregate a weight of more than 1,000 pounds avoirdupois. This, Ralph concluded, was quite sufficient for that trip, and as it would require great labour to cut any more pieces from the underlying mass, he determined to let it alone. So at the end of the 4th day he put back into the hole the rock he had removed, spread the dirt over it, and covered the hole with dead leaves. The 5th day he made 2 trips and brought in the remaining 2 pieces. The tools he hid in the mud of the creek. The next day he collected a sufficient quantity of micaceous earth, and prepared his boxes for inspection. That all this time he had been hunting for gold he did not conceal from Captain Nelson and his brothers, but he did not announce having found any. While at work alone he was naturally considerably apprehensive on account of Indians, partly because he feared to have the Indians discover his mine, and partly from a natural fear of an encounter with the savages. But he remembered how, when Captain Smith was captured, he had kept at bay 200 savages until he had mired and was unable to fight. At least Captain Smith said he did, and there was no one to dispute him. And Ralph felt confident of being able to stand off, if not 200, at least 80, which he knew was about the fighting strength of the Nacotchtanks and greater than the ordinary number of a Masawomek war party. He was in little danger from the latter, for they always came in canoes and did not wander far from the shore. After Ralph had finished getting his gold on the vessel, he remained 3 days longer for appearance's sake, to allow the vessel to be loaded with sassafras and cedar wood. Then the barque dropped down the river, stopping at each Indian village to trade for peltries. The last village left behind, the vessel bore away for the Capes, and Ralph heaved a sigh of relief when he passed between them and was on the broad ocean and bound for England. The voyage home was uneventful, the whole expedition being made in very little more than 4 months. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. Arrived at London, Ralph left his brothers to dispose of the cargo. When the company's agent came on board to inspect the cargo, Ralph opened one of his boxes and showed the agent the glittering earth. The company had received some such earth before, from which the most skilful metallurgists they could find had failed to extract a grain of precious metal. Therefore, when Ralph offered the agent a sovereign as the company's probable 2.5% profit on the contents of the 6 boxes, the latter took the coin with a smile of pity for the deluded young man. Ralph hired a house in London, and had a furnace built in it in which to melt the gold, with crucibles capable of containing each 200 pounds avoirdupois, and cranes with which one man could handle a crucible. He procured some moulds of a size to run bars of about 700 troy ounces each. On the bottoms of the moulds were engraved the words Casa de Moneda Real, Ciudad de Mexico, Royal Mint, City of Mexico, to make it appear that the gold came from Mexico. Working all alone, he cast the gold into bars, some of which he sold to the London goldsmiths for ready money, but the rest he carried over to Amsterdam and deposited in the new bank in that city, there being at that time no bank in London. As soon as possible Ralph went to the officers of the Virginia Company and proposed to buy of them a grant of land, to be bounded by the arc of a circle whose radius was 5 miles, and whose centre was at the head of tidewater on the Potomac, that part of the circle only lying on the left bank of the river. For this he proposed to pay the company £1,500. "Why would you choose that particular spot?" asked the treasurer. "Captain Smith says the cliffs there look in spots as if sprinkled with silver." "Captain Smith sent you a load of that glittering earth. How much silver did you get out of it?" retorted Ralph. "Not a grain, I confess," replied the treasurer. "Not a grain of gold or silver has come from Virginia." "The spot I ask," replied Ralph, "lies at the head of navigation of a broad river. and such I deem a fit place for a city. Then, too, just above is a goodly water power, which I am resolved to make not only turn mills to grind grain, but to saw boards, turn lathes, and do much other work now done by man and beast." The Treasurer thought the young man a visionary. As Ralph was to take out a colony at his own expense, and as the Jamestown colony had already cost the company many £1,000s, the only return for which had been 2 or 3 cargoes of cedar wood and little prospect of a betterment, the company were not loath to take £1,500 sterling of good gold, and give Ralph a grant in fee simple of the soil, waters, forests, and minerals, though they objected somewhat to this item, with the power of lieutenant governor in the local government of the colony, the general government subordinate to the Virginia Council. Ralph's scheme had by this time developed, not merely into establishing a colony, but founding a nation in Virginia. One of Ralph's first cares was to supply his mother with money sufficient to satisfy all her wants, and the next to induce his oldest brother James to give up everything else and act as his agent, in conjunction with John Summers and Edward Morton, Ralph's third brother, now just ready to enter business as a London merchant. As soon as possible he bought a staunch vessel of 200 tons, called the Flora, and induced Captain Nelson to sell his bark and take command of her. Meanwhile Ralph and his agents were engaging emigrants for his colony. The first lot he determined should all go out as his employees, or the families of his employees. With the exception of 3 or 4 mechanics, they must all be labourers, most of them agricultural labourers. The next and most difficult consideration was the religious one. Ralph determined there should be full religious toleration in his colony. The times were, above all others of history, those of the fiercest intolerance and bigotry, of which England was a religious hotbed. Ralph Morton was philosopher enough to see that all the so-called Christian creeds of the age, and 10 times more the practice of the sectarians of those creeds, were bloodthirsty and paganistic, a bitter mockery of the teachings of the Prince of Peace. Perhaps the least intolerant of the people of Western Europe of that time were the English Catholics, among whom was only a small class of fanatics. It would do to admit the moderate Catholics to the colony, but for some reasons it would be unwise to have a majority of them. Next to the Catholics, the Church of England people were least intolerant. Reference is here made to the body of the Episcopalians, not to the officials of the government. The intolerance these officials showed was rather political than religious, rather aimed at sedition than heresy. Although the Church people in authority sternly, even cruelly, repressed the Catholics, it was for 2 strong reasons. First, the diabolical plots of a few fanatics, mostly Jesuits, plots which the great body of English Catholics abhorred, and of which they were innocent. And second, the clamours of the great and growing body of Puritans, a sect or variety of sects of fanatics, who, although they did much to restore English political liberty when it was at its lowest ebb, carried religious intolerance to its utmost extremity of virulence and violence. These intractables Ralph resolved to shut out from his colony as long as possible. But as a large portion of the labouring class of England, especially the rural class, were adherents of the Established Church, and rather indifferent ones at that, it was not difficult to procure colonists among whom religious toleration could be sustained. The disasters of the Jamestown colony had been kept as secret as possible, and great numbers of English people were willing to go to America. The Virginia Company could have found shiploads of honest labourers, but they thought a dissolute gentleman, or even his footman or valet, was more worthy than an industrious peasant. Ralph Morton had no such class prejudice. He wanted educated persons for teachers, clerks, physicians, etc., but for the rest, no man who was unwilling to do 6 days' good hard manual labour a week. The time of sailing was fixed so that the colony should arrive at their destination at the end of the winter, yet early enough to clear ground and plant corn and vegetables. Ralph again took with him his brothers Henry and Charles. Besides the Mortons and the crew of the vessel, there were 44 men, 12 women, and 18 children. It was not until the third voyage that any women had ventured to go to the Jamestown colony, but Ralph had sufficient confidence to take along the families of 12 of his men whose wives were willing to go. Among the men were 2 carpenters, 1 mason, 1 shoemaker, and 1 blacksmith. The Flora sailed from the mouth of the Thames on the 20th of January, 1610, and arrived at her destination on the Potomac the 18th of March. Ralph stopped at the village of the Nacotchtanks and purchased of them a piece of ground bounded by the Potomac and the eastern branch, of a day's journey in compass. He paid for the land in red blankets, which the Indians much fancied, and hoes, of which he showed them the use, and gave them a grindstone on which to sharpen them. End of Chapter 7.